1997 Honda CR250R. This is a quick review and overview of this bike that I own. As usual, if you find anything useful in here, please like, subscribe. Much appreciated. 97 CR250 2-stroke 250 cc's of power. This was the first year of the aluminum frame. I used to use steel before this, which mattered a lot in the late 90s. These days, doesn't really matter much. The idea being that steel is a bit flexible. You want some sort of flexibility in the frame to absorb vibration and for handling. This is a bicycle or motorcycle for racing, not made for endurance. You got two kinds of dirt bikes. You got your racing dirt bike, you got your banging around in the woods dirt bike. This was a race bike that I've converted to bang around in the woods. When you read about this bike, they say, oh, they didn't like it, the handling was not the best at the time for racing. And when you're in the woods, that doesn't matter at all. It doesn't really matter how the thing handles on a motocross thing because you're not racing it like that. Things that are noticeable about this thing are how the offset of the fork is, or rather the head tube angle. This thing has a pretty straight up front wheel, so the offset is pretty far back, which makes this thing really good for descending steep mountains. This thing has a lot of power. The bike weighed 214 pounds dry. I've added a few accessories. I think wet they're still under 230, which is pretty light. What are some advantages of two-stroke? Because the engine is low, there's no head on here with rotating cams and stuff. The weight is kind of lower in here. The spinning mass of this is lower in the bike. You can feel that in the handling when you're leaning it over and stuff. The bike has a lower center compared to four-strokes. Four-strokes have some other advantages, but these things feel real nice in the woods. These things make quite a lot of power. This thing was rated at 54 PS, which works out to be like 52 horsepower or something, which is a lot. It has this big pipe on here, FMF gnarly. The point of these, it's fascinating. Inside, it's got a port, and when you reach a certain RPM, the port opens, which essentially makes the exhaust bigger. So low RPM, it's smaller, then it goes bigger. At a certain RPM, the exhaust resonance in this chamber starts to create a backflow of pressure. Essentially, it helps pull exhaust out, so it creates like a supercharging effect for turbocharging. So when you hit the power valve, which just opens the valve, makes the exhaust bigger, the resonance wave from the two-stroke on that, the effect is dramatic. I call it VTEC, because when you hit VTEC, man, this thing takes off. Pulls pretty hard to its 9,000 RPM red line. Some of the things I've done to make this bike better in the woods, they came with pretty tall gearing. I have dramatically reduced the gearing because it's got a motocross racing gearbox, which means a tall first gear and then some short additional gears after that. So I've reduced the gearing significantly. I've currently got a 12-tooth front, 54 on the rear, which is really good for poking around in the woods and hill climbs and stuff. I've got a 14-ounce flywheel weight in there, which essentially just adds chug. So each revolution, there's more weight chugging against it, which keeps it running at low RPM better. It's got pretty good mid-range, not bad low. Really pulls hard on the top. I revalved the shocks. The front fork, there's no guide for it, so after 40 hours of reading, yes, 40, I revalved it. Essentially, you take out some shims to soften them up, softer oil. Same in the rear. 320 millimeters in the front, 320 in the rear. High speed, low speed compression, rebound, everything. I have set it to a pretty soft amount of compression and rebound for woods riding. Got a nice new seat. Got lots of brakes. Basically, I've rebuilt this bike with every possible endurance part you could possibly have, which costs a fortune for a 1997 motorcycle. But you get a pretty nice ride, brand new seat. One thing about these race bikes is the airbox. The airbox is situated under the seat here, which feeds directly into that carburetor. There's a air opening underneath here, which is protected by the mud flap. However, you do not want to drown this bike in water. Bikes like a Yamaha, they have an airbox up here that's more sealed, so you can completely drown this thing in mud and it's fine. This bike, you don't want to do that. Ask me how. The entire motor is completely rebuilt. Everything is new. Don't get this thing. Don't. I mean, it was deep, pretty deep. It can happen. You look at a mud puddle. Is it an inch deep? Is it 5 feet deep? Who knows? This thing has triple clamps on it. Basically change the offset of the fork, stick it out a bit. I think it changes the handling actually on mountain bikes, it does. Came with it. I don't know exactly what it does, but fork offset rake handling, more downhill awesomeness. Brakes are pretty good. It's got a aftermarket clutch in there. It's got some weight to it, but you need that with the power this thing has. It's pretty fun off-road. I mean, you know, when you get on it, man, it goes pretty fast. At the time, this motor, they made changes after this pretty much immediately to, they ran this motor for a few years and then went one with it was a bit more mid-rangey and took the top end power. So this motor, the 9798, is rated at one of the most powerful you could get. And man, it hits hard. The lower gear and flywheel weight helping make it work off-road. It's been pretty good. I've been riding this bike for 5 years, 6 years. It's just rebuilt everything. Pretty cool thing to play with. God, they made a 500 two-stroke version of this. I can't imagine what that would be like. So fast. This thing is already pretty fast. Anyways, you guys own a CR250? Different years? What's your experience been? This is a pretty ridiculous, fun thing to ride. I've really enjoyed it. Hope you found this useful. Leave some comments below on what you think, and see you in the next one.